I went to Imperial in 1965, the maths department, as a new undergraduate, and David joined from Birkbeck in 1966. So he taught the first statistics course that I ever took in my second year. So I guess, in a sense, I met him then, but you don't really count that because, you know, he was at the far end of a lecture room. When I left Imperial, I went off and joined the Central Statistical Office and did a couple of years. That was then part of the Cabinet Office under Klaus Moser, and I spent a little bit of time there. I had a year's sabbatical in Italy, and then I decided I really wanted to go back and do a PhD. And at that point, because I was based in London, it was natural to go back to my old department. David, by that time, was head of department, so I had an interview with him, and I suppose that really was my first meeting. I suspect even then he was much better known than I was aware of as a sort of raw undergraduate. But I took, as an undergraduate, I had very little, it was almost all maths, very little probability and statistics, but I had a course on stochastic processes, which I really enjoyed. Not from David, but that was taught from his book with Hilton Miller, and that had only come out in 65 or 66, so it had just come out. So I was aware that, because I'd studied that book, and looking back on my shelves, I've got a couple of other books that he wrote, one on Q's with Wally Smith, and a little renewal processes monograph. And both those obviously date from my undergraduate days, so I must have known that he'd written several books. Interestingly, in those days, as I say, David was head of department, he was also, of course, head of statistics. There were about a dozen or so of us research students, and he supervised all of us. So he saw us all for an hour a week. He'd read through work we'd done, he'd make suggestions, you know, point us in directions. But he didn't work with us in the way that perhaps some supervisors do. When I started, he gave me a big pile of papers. He'd just been to a conference in 1971, a conference on point processes. He brought back all these preprints. So, you know, here's your stack, go away and find yourself a problem. But he was great, and of course he led by example. We all went, all the staff and students went to everything in the department, all the seminars, the study groups and so on. We all went to the Friday seminar. It was a joint University of London seminar in those days, where all the departments got together. We rotated around the colleges. And David really led from the front then, charging down Exhibition Road, down the escalator. You weren't allowed to stand, you know, posse of us behind. And then you had to be positioned on exactly the right point on the platform, so that when you got out the other end, you were positioned for the exit, you know, and he knew, wherever we went, he knew which carriage we'd got to be in. He was really good to work with. It was very rewarding. I learnt so much working with him. I learnt how to write, how not to use 3 words when one will do, you know, none of this in the case that, but when, you know, you see all these things crossed out. No, he was excellent, and I moved to UCL in 1978, so then we were no longer in the same department. But we actually lived a few hundred yards apart in Ruislip. So we got together in the evenings, which worked very well. I'd got 2 very small children. So he used to come round when they were in bed, and we would work together. And brown envelopes, because everything was handwritten in those days, you know. So and David's notes were incredible, his writing is tiny, if you've ever seen it, very small, so you'd spend happy hours deciphering his writing. But these pages of notes would go backwards and forwards in brown envelopes between the 2 houses. You know, and sometimes in the evening I'd go round and deliver something, and I'd go home and think, oh, I've got to take the rest of the evening off now. And then a few hours, or an hour or so later, I'd hear the letterbox go and I'd know it would be back again. So. The one that we both valued the most, I mean, of ones that we were involved together, was with Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe. So Ignacio was a Venezuelan hydrologist, as I would argue probably as distinguished as David. He'd won loads of prizes, including the Stockholm Water Prize, which is a sort of hydrology equivalent of a Nobel Prize. Very, very distinguished. But David met him. He went to a conference in Caracas, I think in 1986, and he was lost in a corridor and asked somebody for directions. And that person happened to be Ignacio. They got talking. Ignacio knew of David's work. He was another very well-read and broad sort of person. So they got talking. David came home with something really exciting to work on, got me involved, and the rest was sort of history, really. So we worked together for about 20 years, on and off. In fact, Ignacio died about 2 months ago. So I feel, you know, they've both gone. It's just unbelievable this year. For me, because that's where my interest is in probability and stochastic processes, it's all the work he did in that area and the way he approached problems. He had this ability to extract the essence of a problem, to simplify it, to write it in simple, as a simple sort of mathematical form that was then accessible to being able to solve it. He wasn't a great one for simulation. I mean, he didn't go at a problem by thinking his first route is to simulate it. He wanted to build a mathematical explanation for things, and then to be able to analyse it algebraically or whatever and get its properties. And if you've done the job well, then the behaviour of the process you've got ought in some sense to reflect the behaviour of the physical system, but you'd use that to test your model rather than trying to fit one to the other. So it was that sort of approach that I particularly tried to emulate in some way. He's best known in many ways for the proportional hazards model. David, of course, would never call it a Cox model any more than he called the stochastic process a Cox process. It was always a doubly stochastic Poisson process. But you know, that was what was known because it was used so widely outside statistics in so many fields. It was so important. I don't know, is that the most important thing he did? In one sense it is, because it had so many effects. But on a real sort of technical level, there were so many other things he did. All the sort of work on inference, on design of experiments, on, you know, just... I think that's really what made him so special, this incredible breadth of work that he was able to do. That was the side I saw, certainly, that he, and I think that came right from the beginning, you know, from the work he did during and just after the war with the War Research Association and all those sort of things. And these were genuine applied problems that needed to be solved. And therefore David, although he did quite a lot of theoretical work, he wasn't interested in theory for its own sake. It seemed self-evident to him that if you have a physical system, that it makes sense to talk about a conditional probability of something happening without having to prove the existence or the conditions for existence. This was not the side of the work that he was most interested in. We tried to divide the areas up, pick the main areas, so the design, the statistical methodology, the inference, the stochastic process. So we picked the main areas and also tried to look at the main where all the main works were, the books particularly, of course, and the most famous papers anyway. I'll call them that rather than the most important papers, but and to see how those were going to fit in, and then we divided those areas up between us, and of course all the biographical stuff, and each wrote our own sections, and then we sort of swapped them around and tried to overwrite and blend, but it was actually remarkably easy. Nancy and Anthony were wonderful to work with, very easy. We agreed on everything, so it wasn't a difficult process. It was actually enjoyable in making it work. The challenge was really to feel that we could do anything that would even remotely do him justice, I think. One of the things we did notice between us trying to look at an awful lot of the papers, and I say there are more than 20 books and 350 papers, so writing the obituary was quite a challenge. And I don't suppose we did look at all of them, but everywhere you went, even papers you'd never heard of, and you'd start to read them, and you think, oh, that's rather clever, that's interesting, you know, and there's something everywhere. And I think we wrote in the obituary, just pick out a paper at random from this 350 plus list and have a look at it and see what's there. Perhaps the other thing, again, that I knew but we haven't mentioned and perhaps should, is that his contributions were his own research contributions, but the amount of help that he gave other researchers. I mean, if you ever went to a conference with David, there would be a queue at every break waiting for people waiting to talk to him. He got so many requests for comments and help from people, and he always tried to answer, to make suggestions, to comment in a very sort of helpful way, a gentle way. He even if he was being critical, he would couch it in terms that made it comfortable to receive that criticism. So he helped a lot, many generations of researchers over and above those of us who were lucky enough to be his students. He was editor of Biometrica for 25 years, alongside that. So that was certainly, he was doing that when I was a research student, when I was at Imperial anyway, because he would, when we travelled back on the tube together, he would be refereeing papers. He refereed all the papers that were submitted to Biometrica in those days and commented on them. He often would send comments on ones that weren't accepted, helpful comments. Just amazing, you know, he'd be strap hanging on the tube and reading this paper and dozing off perhaps a bit as well. So it's just phenomenal, the amount, the sheer volume of stuff that he was able to do and get through. Just incredible. I hope there's enough in there just to give a little glimpse of the person he was. You know, the little, the little jokes and things that we always had if you worked with him. That, you know, there were always jokes going on between you, and we tried to give just a little bit of a flavour of that. Well, I learnt at the feet of a master. He was fantastic, but it was always enjoyable. We had all these jokes, so I will remember that twinkle in his eye. It was always nice to see him, always. We shared a lot. After David died, Ignacio wrote to me, and he wrote, and of course then I didn't know he was going to die a few months later himself, but he wrote, "To have been close to you and David is one of the most wonderful experiences that I had, not only for the science, but much more for the rich and happy personal times we share. Now, as I'm about to turn 80, they are as vivid as many years ago. David was an example of scientific excellence, personal class, generosity, humility, and great humour." Well, I think that says it all, really. What more could you you say. And it's equally true of them both. I mean, they were two of a kind. So it's my huge privilege to work with David. As I say, I started my PhD in October 1971. So in October 2021, we went out to lunch to celebrate 50 years, and that was the last time I saw him, so I shall remember that.